Okay. Again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 7th installment of the Harvest Strategies webinar series. Today's installment is titled How to Involve Stakeholders and Local Communities in Management Procedures and Management Strategy Evaluation Development. My name is Joe Zalazny, and I'll be your host today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a fishery officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and I'm also the interim project manager of the Common Oceans Tuna Project. The Tuna Project is led by FAO and funded by the Global Environment Facility, and its activities are delivered through a unique partnership of 25 organizations, including the 5 tuna RFMOs, as well as intergovernmental organizations, civil society, and industry groups. I'd also like to note that each of today's speakers hail from organizations that we count among the project's partners. If you'll indulge me, I'd just like to provide a little bit of additional background information about the Tuna Project. The mission of the project is to promote responsible, efficient, and sustainable tuna production and biodiversity conservation in the face of a changing environment. The project does this by supporting and informing decision-making by tuna commissions and their subsidiary bodies. The project is organized around 3 components. These components include improving tuna fisheries management and governance, and the primary areas of work within this component are developing capacity for management strategy evaluation and management procedures, and this webinar is a prime example of that work, as well as work to promote the operationalization of the ecosystem approach to fisheries management and climate change in decision-making within the tuna RFMOs. The second component is to improve compliance and tackle IUU fishing. The project does this by supporting adoption of electronic monitoring, as well as a number of activities aimed at developing human capacity for fisheries control and enforcement in tuna RFMOs. And the final component is to improve environmental performance of RFMOs, and this work is primarily geared around quantifying, mitigating, reducing bycatch in tuna fisheries. One of the Tuna Project's desired outcomes is to have all major tuna stocks fished at sustainable levels by 2027, when the project will conclude. The work to develop capacity for Harvest Strategies implementation in tuna RFMOs, led by the Ocean Foundation, is a critical component of the project's work to achieve this outcome. In addition to the quarterly webinars like we're having today, our partner, the Ocean Foundation, also hosts a website, www.harveststrategies.org, which serves as an online clearinghouse for all things related to harvest strategies. This website is available in English, French, and Spanish, and some key materials are available in up to 13 languages. So I encourage you to visit the website if you aren't already familiar with its contents. Now, in just a moment, we'll get started with our first presentation, but first, just a few orders or a few items of housekeeping. Today, our webinar is 120 minutes or 2 hours. Please turn off your camera and mute yourself unless you are speaking to keep the line clear. This meeting is being interpreted in English, Spanish, and French. So if you'd like to enable interpretation, choose the language of your choice from the little globe at the bottom of the taskbar in your Zoom application. We'll hold all questions until the end after we've heard from all of our speakers. At that time, we invite you to either raise your hand and ask a question live, or alternatively, you can put your questions into the chat during the presentations, and we will call on you at the end in the Q&A session. The final point is that this session is being recorded so that it can be uploaded to the Harvest Strategies YouTube channel and will be available after for folks who weren't able to join us today. So again, this webinar is the 7th in a series of 16 quarterly webinars that are being organized in collaboration with the Tuna Project. Today's session, how to involve stakeholders and local communities in MP and MSE development. Our panel includes leading experts from around the globe who will share practical lessons, proven strategies, and insights on fostering collaboration for sustainable and effective modern fisheries management. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Shayna Miller with the Ocean Foundation will present on a stakeholder's view on the role of stakeholders in MSEs. Shayna, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to provide a very introductory view to, stakeholder engagement in MSEs. So let me just share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that? Joe, is that okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so starting off a webinar on stakeholders, just a really fundamental question. What is a stakeholder? And when most people think of stakeholders in fisheries management, they think about commercial fishers. And, what we as, of course, myself as a nonprofit stakeholder, an environmental group stakeholder, the definition of stakeholders is actually much broader. It's not just commercial fishers, but also recreational and artisanal fishers. It's also members of the seafood supply chain, processors, dealers, buyers, retailers, even consumers can be considered a stakeholder. And then, of course, environmental groups. And so when we talk about stakeholder engagement in management procedure development using management strategy evaluation, we want to consider all of these different groups. So in the stakeholder participation spectrum, in kind of the academics of stakeholder participation, there are 5 different levels of stakeholder participation, ranging from a very light touch of informing, so you'll just tell the stakeholder what you're doing, to kind of a median level of engagement where you consult, you ask for their opinions, but you may not do much with those opinions. You can involve them, really considering the stakeholders' views and opinions throughout the process, to a much higher level of engagement where you collaborate. For example, in the MP context, stakeholders might be submitting different candidate management procedures for testing. They may be providing data, et cetera. So that would be collaborating. And then the highest the highest level of engagement is empowering. And so where you're actually making the stakeholders as part of the decision-making process. Now, in this case, for MSEs, the range is really in those middle 3, consulting to collaborating. Sometimes it can just be informing, but that is not ideal. And never, as far as I'm aware, in an RFMO context, are stakeholders part of the actual decision making. So you're really looking at inform, consult, involve, collaborate when it comes to MSE. And so this is just a little schematic of the main steps of harvest strategy, management procedure development and adoption. Your stakeholders and managers are agreeing on your desired outcomes for the fishery. You're setting your management objectives. Your scientists are creating this virtual reality simulation of the system to test the different MPs. Your MSE, the stakeholders and managers are reviewing and considering the results together, and then it's the managers that are adopting the final MP. So again, this is why we're not at the empower part of the spectrum. And it's important to remember that stakeholder participation and engagement is really one of the hallmarks of MP's development and MSE, and including transparency, inclusivity. And so this stakeholder point is really important. So looking at the roles in MSE, so MSE being the process of developing an MP, the tool that's used to develop a management procedure. There are many different steps, and then even once it's adopted, you need to evaluate your MP performance in the long term. And I won't go through all of these steps here. You can see them on the screen, but the important point of this slide is anytime managers are the key participant at a step, you also have a check for stakeholders because it's really via the managers that stakeholders are getting their views heard and considered. And I want to just highlight four key steps where stakeholder engagement is really important. The first step, like, should we even be pursuing an MP for the stock? That's something where stakeholders may have views, defining the management objectives, setting the vision for the fishery, providing feedback on the MSE results. This is a management procedure that would work for our fishery, or this management procedure is too risky from a conservation perspective, providing those kind of views on the MSE results. And then in selection of the final MP, giving their views on which one they think will perform best based on the results. So those are kind of the four major key steps for stakeholder engagement in this process, in my view. So stakeholders, again, a really important part of the process, as far as lessons learned through different MSE processes around the world. One of the best ways to foster stakeholder engagement is setting up these science management dialogue groups, or SMDs as they're called in some areas. And if you look at the three general objectives of having a science management dialogue group for MPs and MSEs, it's enhancing communication, fostering understanding, building capacity, and of course, you have stakeholders mentioned as a key group here. Getting collaboration with on the science side, um, less relevant to the stakeholders, but here the third one, very important, um, facilitating development of your candidate management procedure elements, like your management objectives, for example, and selecting your final MP. Again, really important for stakeholder development and stakeholder engagement. And so one of the things that I'm just going to go into a little bit more on these science management dialogue groups. The first of all, how to plan them. Normally you would, if you're an RFMO, you would establish one of these working groups in a formal way through adoption of a management measure. And so, one of the things that you should consider as, developing that management measure is how your SMD is going to function. What priority species are you going to be looking at? Who's going to chair the group? When are you going to meet? How often are you going to meet? Who's going to participate? And when you look at participants, again, it's, scientists, managers, fishing industry representative, conservation groups, other accredited observers. It should be transparent and inclusive again. And then, once you're the science management dialogue group, you've met, how are you going to convey that group's recommendations to the commission at your RFMO? So it's important to outline those points in advance. And when you look at, what a science management dialogue group should be doing, it's really quite a lengthy list. So, what's your work plan and timeline for your MSE? How are you going to fund it? What are your management objectives going to be for individual MSEs? What about your performance indicators that correspond to those management objectives? Your reference points, where do you want your stock level to be and your fishing mortality to be? And of course, what kind of candidate management procedures do you want to be looking at? The SMD is also, the good venue for presenting and receiving feedback on your MSE results, and of course, the place to recommend your final MP elements, including your ECP, exceptional circumstances protocol, which may not happen at the point of initial adoption, but perhaps a year or so after that. And then it's also a group that is well poised to oversee any any peer reviews of the process and management procedure performance to make sure that the process is going effectively and efficiently. So the good news is we now have SMDs at all of the tuna RFMOs with adoption of one at IATTC last year. I made up this acronym since it's a brand new group and it hasn't met yet, so it doesn't have an acronym yet. But you know, it's and it doesn't matter what these are named. But Southern Bluefin at CCSBT has had one of these dialogue groups in place since 2008. So, which is just excellent stakeholder engagement there. And you know, I should point out that this is highlighting the RFMO process for tunas specifically, but it's important, you know, when you have this stakeholder engagement venue at the RFMO level in all of these oceans and all of these tuna RFMOs, it's important for individual governments to have domestic processes to feed in as well. So you know, for example, I'm in the US and the US has an advisory committee that for each of the different RFMOs that the US is a full member of, there's an advisory committee, and that serves as kind of like a miniature science management dialogue where domestic stakeholders at a broader scale, a broader range of domestic stakeholders can feed into the international process. So that's important to consider too from an individual perspective, but also a community perspective. So I'm just going to end highlighting, you know, some of the products we're creating in this project that Joe introduced at the beginning of our session today. You know, communication is key when it comes to engaging stakeholders. You know, the capacity building piece to allow stakeholders to engage meaningfully in the process and get their voices heard and contribute. So we have, you know, we have a website, harveststrategies.org, like Joe mentioned. We have fact sheets, including some, you know, quite high level overview materials. We have animations demystifying management strategy evaluation, for example, this, you know, highly complex modeling tool. And then, you know, online interactive applications where you can interact with and view different MSE results. So all of that is available on our website. And in probably this summer, we will also be launching an e-learning course that was built in partnership with the FAO e-learning Academy, where you can kind of go through this whole online interactive course, including a game where you're, you know, a manager overseeing an MSE and selecting an MP. So it's pretty cool. Amazing educational technology. So, you know, please be on the lookout for that course in the summer. And I will just end here, Joe. Again, plugging our project website as well as social media on X, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my screen, Joe.
Thanks a lot, Shayna. Excellent presentation. Lots of really valuable inputs there. I think, you know, you mentioned that communication is key, and I don't think that can be overstated. Particularly, you know, we're working with organizations that are spread around the world, covering all of the world's oceans, all of the tuna fisheries within those oceans. You know, member states, stakeholders, people are diffuse, you know, spread across all 24 time zones, across multiple jurisdictions. So really communication is absolutely essential, I would agree, in ensuring that these processes can be as effective as possible. So with that, though, I would like to invite our next speaker, Ashley Wilson, who is with the Pew Charitable Trust. And Ashley is going to be presenting on MP Development Offers Lessons for Strategic and Impactful Stakeholder Engagement and Collaboration. So Ashley, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Hopefully you can hear me. Just a quick check. That looks good.
Yep, you're good.
Perfect. All right, let's see if I can share my screen. Hi, hello, everyone. Um, Bear with me. How's that?
All good.
Brilliant. Oh, just a few technical issues here. Bear with me. Okay. So, hi everyone. I'm Ashley Wilson. I am a science officer at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And I'm here today to talk about what we can learn from regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, on strategic and impactful stakeholder engagement during management procedure development, or MP development. The presentation is largely drawing on a similar titled article that I and my co-authors, Shana Miller, just spoke, and Grant Gallen published back in 2023. And I guess first, before we jump into the detail of that study, I want to give a bit of background or additional context. So, according to the FAO SOFIA report, global fisheries resources are kind of continuing to decline, and this is in a large part due to overfishing. So, we see a growing proportion of the world's fisheries being unsustainable, which highlights that perhaps the traditional fisheries management approach is often falling short in a few key areas. And so some of these might be that the traditional fisheries management is encouraging perhaps short-term decision making on things like annual catch limits, which can fail to deliver these long-term objectives of sustainability and can fail to sufficiently manage risks and uncertainties like environmental change due to climate change, for example. Sometimes these systems can have poor stakeholder engagement, and which leads to poorer buy-in, and then this can often provide challenges for things like compliance. So continued failure in all of these parts presents a threat to stocks and ecosystems, which can only be negative for livelihoods and wider society wishing to take advantage of these resources. And this can kind of break down trust and negatively impact the credibility of management systems. So there's something that needs to be done here. And the FAO report highlights that we need to replicate successful policies and regulations. And I'd add that we need to move away from perhaps some of these tug-of-war, short-termist fisheries negotiations to having more collaborative and rule-based management systems. And to have that collaboration requires stakeholder engagement and inputs. Just keeping on trend about RFMOs, because that's what we're here to talk about today. Well, what else does the FAO SOFIA reports say? Well, it doesn't report on the percent of sustainable stocks under each RFMO's mandate, although others do look at this. But it does highlight that the global importance of these major commercial tuna species. It also highlights that there's a greater proportion of these tuna stocks being fished at sustainable levels when compared to this kind of all stock or declining global average. And it also highlights that in recent times, there's perhaps a slight increasing trend on the major tuna stocks being managed at sustainable levels. So they're bucking the global trend. And what does that tell us? The question is, what are some of the tuna RFMOs starting to do right? And the SOFIA report also highlights that effective fisheries management is important, and highlights that data collection, reporting, and access to data are a key component, as well as management procedures or harvest control rules that can rebuild and maintain sustainable stocks. I also want to give a nod to the FAO Blue Transformation part, which basically says that effective fisheries management systems need to address ecological, social, and economic objectives whilst considering trade-offs. And MSE and management procedures provide us with a means to look at this. So to come back to the question, what can we learn from various RFMOs on MP development with and their stakeholder engagement processes? So this is a schematic of a management procedure development process and its implementation cycle. A few broad points here is that there's a positive trend towards using an MP approach in many internationally managed fisheries, particularly in the tuna RFMOs, which is good. And this involves kind of shifting towards aiming to meet predefined management objectives, by having pre-agreed and simulation tested harvest control rules or measures. So during MP development, rules are set, rules set fishing opportunities as scientifically tested using MSE to see which ones can perform best in achieving these management objectives. But really importantly is that the process here provides several opportunities for stakeholder engagement and inputs at the start of the process, like Shana said, on management objectives, during the MSE process, and also during MP adoption and in the review process. I'd like to also say that it can be a good vehicle for ecosystem approach to fisheries management because it invokes discussion on trade-offs between different management objectives. So I'll skirt through this slide because Shana already covered it largely in her slides, but basically I'm arguing here that stakeholder engagement is not just a formality, it's actually crucial for effective fisheries management. And stakeholders could include diverse groups that are affected by or affecting fisheries. So this could include, scientists and managers themselves, fishers, indigenous communities, NGOs, seafood communities, and many more. I also want to flag the importance that stakeholders provide unique data, knowledge, and information and perceptions into the management process. And scientists and managers typically lead these processes, but it's important how they collaborate with other stakeholders in the process. And the key challenge here really is getting the balance right and the points of entry right throughout the process. And as Shana alluded also in her presentation, this requires a plan. How are you informing, consulting, involving, or collaborating with the stakeholders at key points in the process? Some bodies like ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, they have principles for stakeholder engagement. This can help clarify roles and responsibilities. And also, again, communication is really important part of the process. In sum, if you can kind of get this right, it stands to increase the relevance, the salience and legitimacy, credibility and trust in the management system, can lead to more successful adoption and implementation of management procedures, as well as help you achieve those management objectives like sustainability goals. And this, I suppose, results in a more robust management that accounts for the diverse knowledge sets and information. So there's several points in MSE and MP development where stakeholder engagement and collaboration is key. So we heard about defining the management objectives, in contributing towards acceptable levels of risk, towards limit and target reference points, determining, like helping select the appropriate reference points and providing views on performance indicators, actually putting forward and the testing of candidate management procedures or harvest control rules, in defining kind of what are the key uncertainties in the fisheries and helping test robustness of management procedures to those. Also, very importantly, providing feedback on the MSE results before you jump into MP adoption and also during the MP review process. So really, it requires some like formalized structures and processes to get this right, as well as in planning for engagement and communication from the very outset, using the appropriate methods throughout. So in our study, to come back to that, we looked at 4 different case studies that demonstrated examples of both good and perhaps poorer practices in stakeholder engagement or not so successful. And this offered some lessons and insights. So the 4 case studies we looked at were Atlantic bluefin tuna, Greenland halibut, Atlantic mackerel, and Pacific Sauri. So I produced this summary table to kind of broadly reflect the discussion in the paper. But as I said, we examined stakeholder involvement at key stages of management procedure development. And the results basically showed that structured engagement can help. And also that quite rather unsurprisingly, approaches vary. I'll run through some of the case studies briefly. So Atlantic bluefin tuna, I think, was probably one of the strongest, or a good success story in many parts. Stakeholders contributed through structured groups, for example, in like panel 2 meetings, as well as and provided inputs on things like management objectives, MP specifications, and weighing the scientific uncertainties. Really cool feature of the bluefin case study was that we had ambassadors that were nominated to hold meetings and to provide updates on the MSE and MP development process to help facilitate communication. And eventually the MP was adopted and is being implemented, and kind of demonstrates that inclusion can foster, support and buy-in, but also navigate some of the challenges involved in the management of the stock. Greenland halibut, I think probably, if I had to summarize, shows kind of effective process, perhaps maybe slightly more limited representation of stakeholder interests. So that also had a dialogue group, but participation between scientists, managers, and a narrow pool of perhaps industry interests. But despite this, the group effectively navigated and facilitated both an MP adoption as well as a review process. So this highlights that limited stakeholder engagement can still work, but perhaps there's things that could be done to improve that, like legitimacy, inclusivity going forward. The case of Northeast Atlantic mackerel shows where things culminate and end up going wrong, perhaps contributing to governance failure. So there's a complex history to the stock. There's historical disputes on quota shares that continue to hinder progress. But when we looked at stakeholder engagement, we found that really it was quite limited, quite opaque, and quite siloed in terms of keeping management and science processes quite separate. For example, there was limited to no stakeholder input on management objectives, the risk levels, reference points, key uncertainties, or the harvest control rules. Any contributions were through closed door consultations with managers that weren't open and weren't conducted through structured engagement. And there was limited engagement from stakeholders in the actual mackerel MSE. And ultimately, political disputes on allocation have kind of contributed to derailing the process. So an MSE that was conducted in 2020, it wasn't utilized. The stock continues to decline. And so kind of highlights that without structured engagement, you're putting yourself in a more difficult place to address some of the key issues in terms of stock depletion and management. Pacific Sauri was a kind of an earlier stage, but they show some good promise in terms of learning from the efforts of others. Stakeholder engagement again was done in the early stages via a dialogue group. Some inputs occurred from stakeholders also during the review of the MSE results and in NPFC's harvest control rule selection. And since the paper was published, they adopted a HCR, and there's some more work that's required to get a fully specified management procedure. So the key takeaways really were that stakeholder engagement varies widely amongst RFMOs, and I think that's okay. But having dedicated engagement structures enhances collaboration on management issues, adoption, and the legitimacy of the MPs that get adopted. Where SMD groups were present, they have facilitated stakeholder input at to different degrees, and so the paper provides more details on that. But a clear thing that I would say is that investing in capacity building and MSE communication is worthwhile, and the ambassadors aspect of the ICAT experience kind of informed stakeholders and provided support for management. So yeah, to broadly summarize my reflections, so ICAT, MPFC and NAFO case studies provided positive lessons as structured dialogue leads to MP, leads to progress on MP development and adoption. I'd also note that other tuna RFMOs not in the study also use these dialogue groups, as Shana alluded, CCSBT, IOTC, IATTC and WCPFC, sorry for the acronym soup. But it would take me a long time to read them all out. The NEAFC and the coastal states process provides perhaps a cautionary tale where opaqueness and short-term negotiations with limited stakeholder engagement can contribute to governance failures. Perhaps there's an opportunity to improve that going forward when a new MSE request will be requested, hopefully for 2025, and they may include a greater deal of stakeholder engagement in that process. Sorry, I know I'm out of time. I'm just about to finish, but really MP development is an opportunity to develop and improve stakeholder inclusion in fisheries governance. Stakeholder engagement is crucial, really, for fisheries and an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. And that effective engagement leads to better decisions, trust, and adoption of science-based management. We'd argue that having formalized structures and processes, such as SMD groups, to engage stakeholder development in MP development can help with its adoption. SMD groups can contribute to kind of, effective development and adoption. It can enhance openness, inclusivity, and transparency, and it can also help integrate stakeholder knowledge, data, and information. However, S&D groups can add administrative and resource burdens and challenges, such as things like stakeholder fatigue. So really planning is key, getting the right balance from the beginning, and really thinking about how you're going to do stakeholder engagement is important. And in the paper, we argued that having SMD groups outweigh the costs. And the examples that we looked at showed efficient progress and the resolution of various management hurdles and MP adoption where they were utilized. And that's it. Thanks for listening. I look forward to hopefully discussing more in the Q&A portion of this talk.
Ashley, thank you very much for the great presentation. Very interesting, and look forward to checking that study out. I hope some of the other participants will also take the opportunity to read the findings in more detail. And yeah, I mean, I think that the evidence speaks for itself. You know, all 5 of the tuna RFMOs have now adopted SMDs. So I hope that indicates that they are finding them to be worth the cost of standing those up in terms of having them help to facilitate the decision-making process, as well as being a sort of formal mechanism through which to bring in stakeholder perspectives. So again, thank you for your presentation. And next, we're going to go to Dr. Nan Yao with the Pacific Community, or SPC, and she is going to talk about stakeholder engagement in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. Dr. Yao, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Depends on where you are. My name is Nan Yao, and I work for the Pacific Community SPC. And just let me get my presentation up. Okay. So today I'm excited to speak about the capacity building and stakeholder engagement effort that my team have led in the Western Central Pacific Ocean, specifically in supporting of developing harvest strategies for the tuna stocks. I will be also sharing some of the lessons we have learned along the way, and I'm looking forward to discuss this topic further with all of you. So first, I will provide some background information on our project. The Western and Central Pacific Ocean provides over 50% of the world's tuna catch. However, the current management systems primarily focus on short-term gain rather than sustainable long-term outcomes. To address this, the Western and Central Pacific Fishery Commission, or WCPFC, introduced a harvest strategy approach in 2014, aiming to ensure better management of tuna stocks, and stakeholders are encouraged to take the lead. So under this background, the MSE project was created to support the development of harvest strategy through WCPFC. One of the project's first key tasks was the development of a stakeholder engagement strategy to provide clear guidance on how to effectively engage stakeholders throughout the process. So one of the key factors this strategy bring to light is the stakeholder identification, which is crucial due to the complexity of WCPFC's membership. So as you can see here, the WCPFC have 14 countries and territory, and it has 26 members, 7 participant territory, and 7 collaborating members. And among the 26 members, they are also, they can be divided into FFA members and non-FFA members. So among the FFA members, we can be further developed into subgroups that formed based on the agreement and the fishery interests. For example, the Takraw arrangement, which is agreement that on the management of the long-life fishery, and we also have the parties to the Nauru agreement, which is agreement on the management of present fishery. So most of the FFA members are small island developing states, while the non-FFA members are generally distant water fishing nations. So adding to the complexity, yes, we have more. There are even more subgroups within the current structure, such as the South Pacific groups is focused on the management of South Pacific albacore. We also have the Melanesian spearhead groups and the West Pacific East Asia VIP groups. So this demonstrates the diversity, the stakeholder groups at WCPFC, and this diversity makes it challenging to ensure all the stakeholders are sufficiently consulted, which is important for advancing the harvest strategy in the region. So this strategy also identifies the engaging objective for the project, and the capacity building is presented as one of the key elements. And this also will be the focus of this presentation. So other than what we have already mentioned before, there are other significant challenges we are facing when we're doing the capacity building and stakeholder engagement activities in the region. This includes the fact the limited experience with the harvest strategy approach with the stakeholder in the region, and also the technical complexity of MSE makes it difficult to understand. And as mentioned before, we have a very diverse and numerous stakeholder groups. Each of them have different priorities, values, cultural backgrounds, which complicate consensus building. And also a significant knowledge gap can be observed among the stakeholders, which leading to varying levels of understanding. Additionally, frequent staff turnover and demanding schedule further complicate things. So responding to these challenges, our objective to capacity building focuses on equipping the participant with the knowledge and skills needed for informed decision-making. In order to do so, was facilitate in-country workshops, providing a comprehensive overview of the harvest strategy that tailored to the national context. We also conduct informal 2-hour online consultation section, focusing on a specific commission issues. In addition, we are presenting and participating in FFA regional meetings, formal WCPFL meetings, and supporting for science management dialogue. So to build long-term regional capacity, we introduced the Pacific Island Fishery Professional Program. This program allows a fishery professional who works at national fishery departments to come to SPC to work within the harvest strategy team for a year. Then the professionals return to their own countries and become the harvest strategy champion. So far, we have 2 very successful alumni, both from Fiji. So let's talk more about our workshop format. Our in-country workshops typically last 2 to 3 days and are designed to be interactive and engaging. We usually include short presentations accompanied by hands-on activities and discussions. We have prepared activities like flow maps, quizzes, and shining apps, which helps make a complex topic more accessible. So let's talk about all these shining apps. Ample is the set of applications that we've been using in the in-country workshops. So these apps has been very helpful in explaining some of the more technical aspects of the harvest strategies, in particular, harvest control rule. We usually start with giving a short presentation, and then we invite the participant to try the apps for some hands-on experience. And it is at this time you can really see the light bulb moment with the participants where they start to putting everything together and it starts to make some sense to them. Moreover, we have also used shining apps to assess in the decision-making process. A tool to explore performance of the candidate skipjack management procedure called Pimple has been developed. It allows users to compare the results of different management procedures by using their favorite performance indicators, exploring trade-offs, and select the management procedure that meet their objectives. A similar tool for South Pacific Albacore has also been developed. It's called Spampo. And we have used this tool in the workshops, and it's been very interesting to follow the group discussion. So the address for those applications are listed in this presentation, and I encourage everyone to check them out. So during the COVID pandemic, we adopt the in-country workshop with online workshops. These workshops are structured similarly to the in-country workshops, but usually with limited agenda to avoiding virtual meeting fatigue. In addition, to better facilitate the decision-making process, we also introduce 2 to 3 hour consultation section. These sections are usually very informal and focus on scientific support for upcoming decisions through WCPFC. So since 2018, 37 workshops have been delivered both at the national and regional level, and around 450 participants have attended the training workshops. 16 countries and territories have received in-country workshops. We have also organized 6 regional workshops. Besides, we have also delivered online informal consultation section with 6 countries and territories. So participant feedback is essential for continuous improvement. We always want to know, how do we do? To measure how effective we are, we use 2 types of surveys. The post-workshop survey that I conducted at the end of the workshop and the tracer survey that conducted 6 months later. Both surveys help us gather feedbacks on the training content and the practical application of the knowledge gained. So I would like to share with you some of the results. First of all, based on the post-workshop survey, overall, the participants have rated the workshop highly. Nearing all of the participants have indicates they have gained new knowledge as a result of the workshop. And everybody find the workshop super relevant to their work. And they can't wait to apply what they have learned to their jobs. And almost all the participants say they will recommend the workshop to a colleague. However, the tracer survey have revealed some inconsistency. Meanwhile, although almost all the participants still agree that they have gained some new knowledge from the workshop, 69% of the participants have found the workshop content challenging, and only 35% of the participants have applied the learning of the workshop in their daily job, and 70% of the participants had shared the learning to their colleagues. So the survey have also revealed the key challenges from the perspective, from the participants' perspective. The first is barriers to learning. So the technical complexity of the harvest strategies, including specific terminology, make it challenging for the participants. And the limited workshop duration and the required preparation from the participants often leaves very little time for them to fully understand this concept. And the participants also reveal the challenge they faced when applying the knowledge is that the decision makers face trade-off and the lack of a clear long-term objective for the fishery, which would lead to the harvest strategy approach not being considered on the regional, on the national level. And on the broader level, many participants suggested that overall limited understanding of the sustainable management practice in the region and insufficient national policy could potentially delay the application of harvest strategies in the region. So our effort has led to several significant achievements, including engaging half of the WCPO region, enhancing knowledge sharing, and accelerating the development of harvest strategy. This effort has contributed significantly to the adoption of the internal skipjack management procedure at the WCPFC Commission meeting in December 2022. And thanks to all the feedback from the participants, we are planning to review our content and the way we approach our workshops to improve our activity to be more effective and continue to improve our work for the next stage. So before I finish this presentation, I just want to acknowledge our funding resource, MFAT, and our team at SPC that delivered the workshop, and the team that helped us collecting the survey, design the survey, and analyze the survey results. And also, of course, I want to thank all the workshop participants. It's because of their dedication, the feedback being fundamental in the successful of our capacity building efforts. And thanks for your attention. I guess we will have a discussion and a question in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nan. Yes, and we will have a discussion and an opportunity for the audience to engage all of the presenters at the end of the presentations. Very interesting presentation. I can see your team has been extremely busy. Impressive, the number of workshops you've managed to deliver across what is an absolutely immense region. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And so now I'll introduce our next speaker. We have Dr. Hilario Murua from the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation. And Dr. Murua will be talking about capacity building in the Indian Ocean. So Hilario, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Can you see my presentation? Can you confirm?
I confirm, yep, and we can hear you loud and clear. And sorry, I should have mentioned, I believe, Hilario, you'll be speaking in Spanish, yes?
Yes, that's
okay. So for anybody who wants the interpretation, please click on the button.
Yeah. So as Joe said, my name is Hilario Murua from the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation and the chair of the IOTC Working Party on Methods, which I believe is the reason I am here today. I will provide my perspective as chair, but also to some extent our ISSF voice as stakeholders on the important and much needed topic of management strategy capacity building. But before I begin, I would like to thank Shana Clow, the Ocean Foundation and FAO for inviting me as a speaker to this interesting webinar. Unfortunately, there will be some repetition because some of the materials that I'm going to present has been already said, so apologize in advance. And as Joe said, the slides are in English, but I will speak in Spanish. And I also echo Joe's comments that it was impressive work done by SPC colleagues, improving and enhancing the capacity of the region. Oops. 1 second. Para dar un poquito de contexto, voy a explicar un poquito las diferencias de stock assessment, management procedures. En la evaluación de stock estamos más interesados en estimar el estado del stock en el pasado, en el presente y luego a través de proyecciones lo que pasará en el futuro. Sin embargo, los procedimientos de gestión o estrategias de gestión, y aquí usamos dos términos que se intercambian, Management Procedure o Harvest Strategies, que creo que es uno de los primeros errores en la comunicación que impide el entendimiento porque no tenemos una terminología estandarizada. Lo importante es cómo llegar al objetivo o encontrar el mejor camino para alcanzar ese objetivo. Y para encontrar el mejor camino para alcanzar los objetivos usamos la herramienta de estrategias de gestión o MSE. Este permite conocer el mejor camino, siendo ese mejor camino robusto a las distintas incertidumbres que tenemos del sistema, como la biología, porque no conocemos la biología de las especies, o la mortalidad natural de las especies, porque no las conocemos. Entonces, ese camino es robusto a esas incertidumbres o al desconocimiento del sistema y que proporciona los mejores resultados entre los objetivos, entre los distintos objetivos de gestión, como la sostenibilidad del stock, pero también el rendimiento o la captura para la pesquería, la estabilidad de las capturas para la pesquería y el riesgo o seguridad para la población. Como indicó en su día Doug Butterworth, acordando, que es uno de los precursores del MSI, creo que está en la reunión, acordando las reglas del juego antes de que se juegue. Pero esto que parece muy sencillo en el papel, no lo es tanto, porque existe un gran número de elementos, conceptos, términos y cuestiones que hay que desarrollar de una forma organizada y que muchas veces lleva a confusión. Lleva a confusión incluso hasta los científicos. Entonces, pues trasladar estos distintos elementos, conceptos, términos y definiciones a todos los demás stakeholders, pues hace que la comunicación sea muy importante. Para una buena comprensión y capacitación tenemos que tener una buena comunicación y yo creo que si preguntase a los asistentes a la reunión pues, si podrían y que sabemos de los modelos operacionales o si están familiarizados con los distintos términos, si saben lo que significan las circunstancias excepcionales, seguramente que la mayoría de los asistentes pues, respondería, pues no estoy lo suficiente familiarizado, me gustaría conocer más, sobre todo en el diverso abanico de stakeholders que forman parte de las OROPs. Y esto actualmente, cuando el tema de MSI y de Management Procedures está avanzando con muchas partes interesadas o stakeholders apoyándolo y también con muchas poblaciones de atunes con EMPI adoptados. Y esto se complica más cuando juntamos los distintos elementos y esto lo que digo yo siempre es incluso para los científicos. Y en esto tenemos que echarnos la culpa los científicos porque no sabemos muy bien trasladar estas distintas definiciones, términos y elementos y no sabemos comunicar muy bien los distintos aspectos del MSI a los otros stakeholders que tienen que recibir la información, mascarla, trabajarla y luego comprometerse y promover acuerdos entre todos los distintos stakeholders. Todo esto es un poquito, se puede resumir en la complejidad del MSI y de los management procedures, que como ha dicho el speaker anterior, incluso se complica más si tenemos en cuenta la diversidad de los países. Por ejemplo, en IOTC tenemos 31 países miembros y la capacidad de la región o la capacidad es muy diferente dependiendo de los países, de la región, entonces esto todavía complica más. No solamente la capacitación, pero también los objetivos de gestión son muy diferentes, por lo que es muy importante que todas las partes interesadas tengan un conocimiento del proceso equivalente para saber dónde pueden influir, dónde tienen que trabajar más y dónde tienen que aportar sus necesidades e intereses. Por lo tanto, todo esto hay que tenerlo en cuenta cuando se diseña un programa de capacitación de MSE y hay que poner mucho esfuerzo de poder llegar a todas las CPCs o todos los miembros de las RFMOS para que puedan discutir todos al mismo nivel de conocimiento o al menos puedan tener una comprensión del proceso, en qué partes cada parte interesada o stakeholder actúa, dónde actúan los gestores, dónde actúan los científicos, dónde actúa la industria, dónde actúan las ONGs. Y aquí la comunicación y capacitación es muy importante. De lo contrario, algunos miembros de las OROPs están en el camino y será más difícil alcanzar el objetivo de adoptar una estrategia de gestión. Como decía Benjamin Franklin, cuéntamelo y lo olvidaré, enséñamelo y quizás lo recordaré, hazme parte y lo comprenderé. Y el objetivo de la capacitación debe ser que los países miembros de IOTC y de las otras OROPs, todos y cada uno de ellos comprenda el proceso y sea partícipe del proceso y de las decisiones que se adoptan. Si no, dejaremos siempre de lado algunos países y serán unos pocos los que tienen la capacidad, el conocimiento, el expertise, los que manejen o conduzcan un poco las decisiones. Como he comentado, y yo creo que esto también lo ha subrayado Sheina y Ashley en su presentación, no tenemos que conocer cómo se desarrollan los modelos ni la parte técnica, eso ya lo harán los científicos, pero debemos conocer cómo es el proceso y dónde nos toca como parte interesada actuar. Y esto también es muy importante para la capacitación. Por ejemplo, como paso 1, los objetivos de gestión. Los adoptan, acuerdan los gestores en un primer paso. Objetivos relacionados con la sostenibilidad, estabilidad de las capturas, rendimientos, etc. Estos objetivos de gestión se trasladan en indicadores para poder evaluar los distintos procedimientos de gestión y esto se hace entre gestores, científicos y otros stakeholders. El paso 3 a 5 se desarrolla la parte técnica donde solamente los científicos tienen el desarrollo de esa parte técnica y luego el 6 y el 7 se comparan los trade-offs de los distintos MPs o procedimientos de gestión para adoptar la MPI definitiva que es responsabilidad de los gestores. Y en este proceso es muy importante el feedback o el diálogo entre los gestores, científicos y otras partes interesadas. Para discutir esos objetivos de gestión, los indicadores, las estrategias de gestión candidatas que se han desarrollado por los científicos, pero también para la capacitación. En este diálogo o feedback no solamente es importante tomar decisiones, pero también es importante capacitar a los miembros para que puedan tomar esas decisiones con la mejor información disponible. En el que se recomendaba un desarrollo de un ME. Y pasaron 8 años hasta que la Comisión en 2010 apoyó el desarrollo de MSI del Comité Científico como herramienta para evaluar las medidas de conservación y gestión. En 2010 también el Comité Científico recomendó que se organizara una reunión sobre MSI entre científicos, gestores y representantes de la historia para un poquito avanzar en el proceso MSI. La Comisión en 2011 acuerda elaborar una hoja de ruta para el MSI En 2014 será la primera reunión de diálogo de gestión. 2015 se adoptan los puntos de referencia objetivo y límite interinos y un marco de decisión. Y en 2016 un hito muy importante cuando se establece el Comité Técnico de Procedimientos de Gestión, que es el marco de diálogo que ha creado el IOTC entre científicos, gestores y las distintas partes interesadas. Y aquí, como he dicho anteriormente, se discuten las opciones de gestión, los objetivos de gestión, etcétera, etcétera, pero siempre es muy importante la parte de capacity building, ¿no? la parte de capacitación. Y todos los años el TCMP recomienda que IOTC ponga las medidas para que se dé esa capacitación. Es que es necesario para tener un diálogo efectivo y mejorar la capacitación de la región en IOTC, y yo creo que esto es extensible a otras OROPs. Primero, un buen facilitador, un buen comunicador. Muchas veces, y esto es mea culpa o nuestra culpa, los científicos no sabemos muy bien comunicar, usamos muchos términos, mucha jerga científica, muchos acrónimos, SDM, MSE, MP, strategies, que vemos que tenemos que facilitar la comunicación. Entonces, un buen facilitador y comunicador creo que es clave para facilitar y mejorar la capacitación. En nuestro caso, en IOTC, hemos tenido la suerte de tener a Graham Pilling, que es parte de la secretaría de SPC, que es un muy buen científico, pero además es un muy buen comunicador. Y eso, la verdad, que facilita la discusión, el diálogo, pero también la capacitación. Una cosa que echamos en falta, o yo por lo menos echo en falta, es un experto en ciencias sociales, un economista, un sociólogo que sea experto en growth y trade-offs, que también ayude en estos diálogos. Un conjunto normalizado de cifras o de figuras y tablas para todas las especies. Muchas veces, en algunas subgroups o en algunos casos, por falta de tiempo, lo que sea, para una especie se utilizan una serie de figuras, mientras que para otra especie se utilizan otras figuras, otro tipo de figuras, otro tipo de tablas, lo que lleva a confusión y hace más difícil la comprensión por parte de las distintas partes interesadas. También términos y definiciones armonizadas. Usamos diferentes términos para la misma cosa, lo que lleva a confusión. Es un pequeño ejemplo y hay diferencias, pero no es lo mismo una management procedure que hardware strategy, pero se utilizan igualmente, entonces eso también puede llevar a confusión y debemos evitar esa confusión. Herramientas educacionales, documentación y cursos que faciliten esa capacitación no solamente durante el TCMP o durante la reunión de diálogo, sino que a lo largo del año. Y luego, como ha indicado la charla anterior el colega de SPC, pues esas workshops o cursos de capacitación anual con el compromiso y asistencia de los distintos miembros de las OROPs. Esto es muy importante porque se aumenta la capacitación de los países que luego van a intervenir en el diálogo. Y también pues, organizar varias reuniones, no solamente capacitación, pero particularmente en aquellos años donde se vaya a adoptar una MP. Por ejemplo, pues, las reuniones de embajadores de ICAT. Y luego pues, otras ideas como puede ser un programa de mentors o un grupo de comunicación entre gestores y científicos en el tiempo que facilite la comprensión y el desarrollo de herramientas de comunicación. En el caso de IOTC, una de las cosas que ya está adoptada es el Comité Científico, y la Comisión adoptó un método estandarizado para presentar los resultados de MSE. Tenemos ya figuras y tablas estandarizadas, que siempre usamos las mismas, que ilustran los distintos MPs, presentan los resultados del rendimiento de cada MP en diferentes figuras y también al final provee un resumen conciso y claro de cada MP, de la performance de cada MP. Esto ayuda bastante y cuando presentamos los resultados siempre utilizamos las mismas figuras, lo que hace que si los técnicos de los países se mantienen en el tiempo, que ese es otro de los problemas que hemos visto, pues sean capaces de llegar a comprender las distintas figuras y tablas. Y aparte de un montón de figuras y tablas, lo que es muy importante es el punto 3, de tener un resumen muy claro y conciso de qué es lo que logra cada MP, porque con ese resumen de 1, 2, 3 páginas, pues el gestor, el stakeholder puede ver si ese MP alcanza los objetivos deseados. Otro ejemplo que tenemos en IoTC son las herramientas educacionales y documentación. Aquí tenéis en la página de iotc.org, bajo Educational Tools, hay un apartado para la MSE, donde tiene pues, información, documentación de lo que es MSE, explica lo que es MSE, los distintos componentes del MSE, y también da unos ejemplos a través de una Shiny App de cómo funcionan algunas de las management procedures que se han testado para diferentes especies, en este caso los forces. Sería el equivalente al Shiny, al Ample que ha presentado el colega de SPICI. También la página de Harvest Strategies y el curso online que está desarrollando el FAO a través del ABNG 2, que dentro de poco será distribuido. Entonces, invito a los participantes a que practiquen el curso y en las distintas herramientas online que existen. Y los cursos de capacitación que ha mencionado también el colega de MSPC. En el caso del proyecto Common Users de FEO de ABNG1, componente de Túnidos, hizo varios cursos de capacitación hasta creo que el año 2021, tanto en San Diego como en Costa Rica, en Ghana, Seychelles, en Sri Lanka, en Tailandia, en Corea del Sur y también en Islas Cook. Un hito también importante en el caso del Océano Índico fue el curso de capacitación de Sri Lanka, que ocurrió en 2017, que fue un curso organizado para todos los países de la región, cuando ya se empezaba a discutir el tema de adopción de distintas Harvest Control Rules y Management Procedures en IoTC. Pero claro, todavía hay que continuar, es un proceso largo y siento un poquito de envidia de la presentación anterior porque en IoTC los cursos de capacitación han sido muy puntuales. En el caso de la Western ha habido, no sé si eran 20 y pico o 30 cursos de capacitación en la región en los últimos 4 o 5 años y creo que ese también es un reto que afronta la IoTC, la falta de financiación y capacidad para organizar estos grupos. El año pasado, en agosto del año pasado, Maldivas también organizó un grupo de capacitación o un workshop de capacitación sobre MSE, que tuvo bastante éxito para los países costeros de IoTC, con una gran asistencia y creo que fue un poquito retomando el trabajo anterior de la FAO, quizás IoTC también tendría que asegurar una financiación para que estos cursos de capacitación se mantuviesen en el corto, medio y largo plazo. Esta foto es un ejemplo del curso que organizó Maldivas y ahí tenemos a Graham, que fue el facilitador esta vez también de ese curso. Pero como digo, es necesario mantener estos cursos en el futuro. Y ya para terminar, como conclusiones podemos decir que es muy importante la participación de todas las partes interesadas en estos cursos o este diálogo, con dos componentes el diálogo para desarrollar las MPs, pero también la capacitación. La capacitación debe ser continua, una formación continua, un apoyo financiero continuo a largo plazo, porque si no, es muy posible que el que haya ido una vez a un curso se le olvide, o cuando vaya a ser parte de una delegación, pues quizá ya no tenga o se le haya olvidado ese conocimiento, o muchas veces lo que suele pasar también es que esa persona ya pues ya no suele, va a un curso, va a una reunión y luego quizás no sigue parte de la delegación, con lo que ese conocimiento se pierde. En este sentido, también es importante asegurar que los miembros de las delegaciones tengan una trayectoria a medio y largo plazo. También comunicadores facilitadores profesionales o buenos comunicadores, por lo menos para la parte de capacitación y diálogo. Evitar la jerga científica y usar analogías simples, fáciles que se pueden entender, siempre y cuando teniendo en cuenta la complejidad del tema. No es un tema, el MSI no es un tema técnicamente simple, sino que es complejo, pero se pueden utilizar herramientas que facilitan la comprensión y la comunicación, términos y definiciones armonizadas y figuras y tablas muy claras y concisas y con un resumen de las distintas características de los distintos MPs. Y con esto creo que he terminado. Muchas gracias por la atención y espero las preguntas. Y voy a subirse algunas en el turno de preguntas. Gracias. Yo, de vuelta para ti.
Muchas gracias, Hilario. Excelente presentación, como siempre. And I will limit my Spanish intervention to those few words. Yeah, effective communication comes through loud and clear. Again, I think that we can all agree that that's a common thread across this work to develop MSE and management procedures. And I really like the quote from Doug Butterworth, agreeing the rules of the game before it's played. I think that that's a nice way of sort of summing up what we're trying to achieve with MSE and harvest strategies and management procedures. And yeah, that includes this idea that you talked about, Hilario, standardizing terminologies, figures, and approaches to doing this work, which it really sounds simple. I mean, it's basic stuff, but when doing it kind of for the first time and in an international context, it's obviously anything but simple. But anyway, luckily, like people like yourself and the other participants in this meeting have been doing an excellent job of making these things happen and working towards sort of standardization so that these processes can be efficient. And with that, I would like to introduce our final speaker. We have Dr. John Walter from NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And John, based on the title of his presentation anyway, has maybe a bit of a counterpoint. The title of his talk is When You Might Not Need Stakeholder Participation in MSEs. So Dr. Walter, over to you, sir.
All right, I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yep,
Good
we got you.
morning, good afternoon, good day to everyone. I'm Dr. John Walter. I am the Deputy Director for Science and Council Services at NOAA Fisheries, Southeast Fisheries Science Center. I'm also the Western Bluefin Tuna Chair at ICAT. And as ICAT recently adopted a management procedure for bluefin tuna, as well as a number of other species, it's an active area of work at that particular RFMO, as well as around the world. And so one of my talks is going to be kind of a counterpoint on when we might not need stakeholder participation in MSEs, which is really having mercy on our stakeholders. And I think one of the concerns that a number of us have is that we might burn out our stakeholder participation, and that we've really got to be conscious of how much time we can engage with them, because it comes at a substantial opportunity cost for them. And I'll go into some of the examples of how we might improve and be most efficient in the time that we ask of our stakeholders for MSEs. So the take-home message is that the true stakeholders, really those are for whom there is substantial opportunity cost for participation in MSE, are essential for informing the conceptual and operational management objectives, effective co-management, and obtaining buy-in and trust for any management action. I think that's true across both the RFMOs as well as within any local country or local regional body that might be developing management. If the people who are most affected by the management action aren't party to it and aren't also part of that process, it's unlikely to be successful. And I think we see that the success is often gained through that buy-in and being part of the process. Those stakeholders are also the ones whose time is the most valuable. They're the ones who are actually giving up opportunity, giving up fishing opportunity, leaving their boats, leaving their processing facilities, or if they're recreational fishermen, they're giving up their free time to be part of this process. And so I think we have an inherent obligation to maximize the time they can give us and to be most efficient with that. So we saw a couple presentations that discussed the different players, their different roles and responsibilities. I thought those were excellent in being able to identify this. I've mapped out and tried to summarize what the stakeholder ecosystem is. There's scientists. We are usually paid to conduct analyses. In most cases, they work for either their national countries or research institutions. They have a motivation to be part of this process, both academically as well as professionally. Managers, who are also paid usually to, and they bear the responsibility for making and implementing the inherently political decision regarding the allocation of scarce resources. And in this case, we're mostly dealing with fish, but we could be dealing with MSEs for many other natural resource decisions. Then advocates. These are professional, often paid representatives of either NGOs, fishermen, or other groups. These individuals don't suffer the same opportunity cost for meeting participation, and they may actually be motivated by meetings and want to attend more of the meetings. And one of the key things here is that the top three groups here, scientists, managers, and advocates, have a vested interest in attending meetings. They're often paid to attend them, and they don't really suffer the same costs for attending that the true stakeholders, who I identify as fishermen, dealers, processors, mainly the individuals who are going to be beholden to the management decisions, the ones that will be most acutely impacted and who suffer the loss of income or opportunity by attending meetings. And so being cognizant of where each of us stand in this to be most efficient with the time that we ask of the true stakeholders, I think is essential here. Also understanding that we have a predisposition for adding more and more meetings on. With the ability to do online meetings, there is little cost for travel, and the situation of meeting overload is quite real and certainly something that we have to be cognizant to avoid. And I think that as we too easily get involved in more and more meetings, our stakeholders may completely burn out from participation, and we don't want that to happen, because then we will lose that opportunity. So then what we've outlined in a paper that I'll mention in the next slide is that not every MSE requires stakeholder participation. And there's really degrees of MSE ranging from the full stakeholder MSE, which we outline as the reasons and rationales for why we should engage in those, to intermediate MSE, desk MSEs, which may simply be an MSE conducted by a single analyst on their computer, and then a lot of approaches that are not MSE, that may simply be simulation exercises that don't require the full feedback loop, risk analyses, or other less resource intensive approaches. The full stakeholder MSE, I would argue, should be reserved for the adoption of binding management advice. For situations where the conceptual and operational management objectives are either undefined or need to be developed, which is where stakeholders come into a keen focus in being able to elucidate what the conceptual and operational objectives are. And a full stakeholder MSE requires high resource and time investment. Unless that investment is available, it's unlikely that that would be successful unless the time and resources available to it are are allocated. Many of the other things can be addressed with intermediate MSEs. And here, one of the things that's often asked of an MSE is to develop harvest control rules. And in many cases, the operational management objectives are already well defined for a harvest control rule because we already have specifications for where we want to be based on status and fishing mortality rate. So in that case, we know where we want to be. It's simply defining how we would get there with our harvest control rule. And in many cases, that doesn't require the full stakeholder participatory process to achieve a pretty good harvest control rule. In this case, we could probably achieve decent harvest control rules without multiple year-long stakeholder MSEs. And then the desk MSEs, there's many research questions that can be addressed quite quickly and quite effectively with much less resource-intensive approaches. And so in a paper on when to conduct and when not to conduct management strategy evaluations that was written by the NIMS or NOAA MSE technical team, and this is a group of MSE specialists throughout NOAA fisheries who work on MSEs and try to catalyze management strategy evaluations across the United States as well as in the RFMOs that we work internationally. And so here we outlined a series of high priority situations for full stakeholder MSEs. And as I mentioned, for the adoption of binding management advice, make it count. Don't waste people's time on things that aren't going to affect them, because that's really the time to harness the full power of an MSE. And then when there's a really difficult policy decision where the status quo being something like a stock assessment, won't address that difficult policy decision. And we would argue that climate change and things that may be affecting our populations as well as our fisheries relative to that are certainly very difficult policy decisions. Here I've outlined that I've shown a figure of the sea surface temperature in two regions of the United States, the Gulf of Maine and Gulf of Mexico, where we're seeing some of the most dramatic increases in sea surface temperature, which are moving stocks around, changing the distribution, potentially changing the allocation of fish and the availability to fishermen, and then creating scenarios that are particularly difficult policy decisions about what to do when stocks either move, migrate, contract, or expand relative to climate change. Then when there are heretofore intractable stakeholder conflicts, such that many of the conflicts really haven't been addressed well or are not addressed well by the current assessment and management process. One of the good examples of that is when there are disenfranchised stakeholders. And in many situations, we have the conceptual and operational management objectives fairly well codified for many of the traditional stakeholders, but there's quite many situations where there are stakeholders who have not been beholden to the process to date. So their needs and concerns are not part of the management considerations. And those stakeholders may either be disenfranchised because they're not had a seat at the table. They're not traditionally been party to a fishery because maybe the fish have moved into their waters, and so they are now new stakeholders, or other barriers to entry to being a stakeholder exist. And in that case, if their needs are not being considered, then the status quo process will not work. And then there are situations where the scientific uncertainty threatens the integrity of the current management approach, or when the status quo management is clearly failing. These are the known unknowns. And in a lot of cases, our current stock assessment process is probably in that situation where non-stationarity is taking the legs out of a lot of our stock assessments, such that many of our benchmarks are moving targets, and many of the things that our assessments rely upon to estimate stock recruitment relationships may be in flux. We know that may be happening. We don't necessarily know how to address that. And then I think the most challenging situation is when the future is really unclear. These are the unknown unknowns. What may happen with dramatic climate change, environmental uncertainty. And in those cases is where a lot of stakeholder knowledge can be effective, particularly because in many situations, stakeholders have dealt with changes in the distribution of fish over many years. They've got institutional or local knowledge of how their communities may have changed and may have adapted to those over multi-year, 50 and 100-year timescales that may be effective and need to be considered in our current management. And ultimately, how we manage for those unknowns is key. And MSE allows us to ask the question, not do we need to know this, but rather is our management robust to the not knowing? And that's the essential part of it, is it robust to not knowing what we can't know, because we don't know what the future is going to hold. Then there's situations where simpler, less intensive approaches may suffice. And a lot of times we're looking to move to empirical management procedures that might improve upon status quo management. This is particularly a situation when the environmental non-stationarity may make traditional stock assessments less effective than empirical management that adjusts catch advice based on an index. But moving to that may not require the full stakeholder participation, because we already may know the operational management objectives. Second, as I mentioned, to adapt or modify a catch or harvest control rule, particularly if time and resources are limited. A pretty good harvest control rule is better than no harvest control rule. Then mainly tactical decisions regarding allocation of survey and scientific resources. Many times we have to make tough decisions about which survey to allocate our funding towards. In that case, MSE is an excellent tool for those kind of operational decision making, but it doesn't open up the operational management objectives because they're already well known and well codified. There's another situation that is somewhat controversial, and quite often MSEs are being used to develop management procedures for certification processes, and there's external pressures at RFMOs to embark upon MSEs. And in that case, spinning up the entire stakeholder process simply for that is particularly time, labor, and resource intensive. And if an external party is going to be benefiting from that, then I would argue that that external party should be contributing to that. And to employ the full stakeholder resource participation is going to be costly. And if that's going to benefit a certain group and not all user groups, then that user group should bear more of the costs. Then also research and scientific questions that don't directly support management advice. In that case, desk MSEs are an excellent tool that analysts can use and the scientists can use on their own to answer many of those questions. So we've seen a number of the lessons learned that have been described by many of my colleagues here in their presentations. And I think I'll just reiterate some of the lessons that we've learned in employing stakeholder participation in the MSE process. First of all, show, don't tell results. Without showing, really the results don't sink in and matter to people. And I can't reiterate that more. Then distill the material and the presentation down to the decision points. Avoid unnecessary material. Scrutinize your material to the most essential things that people and particularly stakeholders need to know relative to the decision points. If there is no decision point, consider, does that really need to be presented? Then listen to the stakeholders. Build in what stakeholders want. Test it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, then you show that it doesn't. Because in MSE and MP development, it's performance that matters above all else. Then enforce data guillotines. Don't let perfect be the end of the good. And the reason for this is because an MSE that lasts many years, which I've been part of, particularly the Bluefin MSE, certainly risks stakeholder, scientist, manager, and every part of the participation fatigue. And if one doesn't enforce those kind of guillotines on the process, that we say, this is the data, after this, we're going to not add more data, these are the operating models, we're not going to change them, then we will never actually complete these on time, because it's always too easy to say we need to add something else to it. Next, be inclusive. Every participant has their finger on the trigger of no. Use ambassadors, and a number of the MSEs that we heard about are using this process to be able to translate both literally and figuratively the key decision points into the languages that people understand. Well, whether that language is some of the official or unofficial languages that participants need to understand this, or whether that language is simply plain language in trying to translate the jargon that we scientists use into concepts that people can understand. And then make it count. Use real TAC advice numbers, ones that people understand, Once you put TAC numbers out there, then that gets people's attention. And then make it matter to decision makers. Don't make it a simulation exclusively. It needs to be something that resonates with them, because that's really the only time that the difficult decisions get made. And then, as Shana pointed out, use and employ intermediary groups to be able to bridge the gaps between the different user groups. And so the take-home message, again, I'll end on this, that stakeholder attention is such a precious resource. Focus it on the highest profile, paradigm-changing, and management decision applications, and be prudent in the allocation of what is the scarcest of all human commodities, which is our time. And so I think we need to be conscious about stakeholder disengagement. There are times when we need to have mercy on our stakeholders such that we don't risk burning them out, because when we really need them to crystallize the management objectives or to help us solve the unknown situations, that's when we want their full attention. So I'll acknowledge many of my ICAT colleagues who've helped put together this presentation material and do much of the ambassador work on the Bluefin MSE, the NIMS National MSE Working Group. My NIMS colleagues who've been working on many of our domestic MSEs in the United States, our academic partners, and then the sponsor support from harveststrategies.org, who has developed many of the communication strategies that I think have been effective in communicating the MSE message to stakeholders. With that, I think I will hand it back over.
Dr. Walter, thank you very much. Interesting presentation. And yeah, I think that your title was a bit, maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, but yeah, certainly, I don't think anybody can disagree with your point, which is that we want to respect people's time. We want to use their time efficiently and effectively. And I also really liked the term data guillotines. This was a new one to me, but certainly you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You need to, at some point, the group needs to come together, make a decision to move forward. And I think we've seen, or at least, as I'm somewhat new to MSE, some of them have been completed really in an amazingly short amount of time, and others seem to drag on for years and years and years. And I think it's, there may have been some research into why that is, but certainly figuring out how to move them through more quickly would be, I think, valuable line of questioning. So with that, I would like to open it up to questions. So to our audience members, please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to pose a question. And I see we've got one question, and you're also welcome to put questions into the chat, and we can call on you that way as well. So I see Doug Butterworth has a question. Doug, please.
Thanks, Chair. If you can bear with me for 2 comments before I get to the question. I'd like to start by particularly commending John for his penultimate slide on lessons learned. I think there's a lot of very important stuff in that single slide. Possibly in the report of the meeting, I'd suggest you emphasize the contents of that slide. First of all, Chair, since you asked about data guillotines, let me just say a bit about that, because this is critical. And the presence of 2 data guillotines in any MSE exercise, that's a data guillotine on data and a second data guillotine on the operating models used for the testing, is absolutely essential. This came out of the IWC, which probably has the most experience with this, and one exercise that went on for 20 years. And they did a very careful analysis of what was wrong. And the problem is people always want to do more, and can't we take this new bit of data into account? No, you can't, otherwise you'll never finish. Witness the 20 years. What you do is you say, we're going this far, and then we'll complete the process. And anything new we'll put off to the next process. So that's the origin, that's absolutely critical. The second point is I can't take, in fairness, complete accolades for the agree the rules before you play the game. That originates from a scientist called Alec McCall, who most of you are probably too young to remember, but basically Alec was the Californian scientist who wrote the post-mortem for the collapse of the Californian sardine in the middle of last century. And it was his fundamental piece of advice that came out of that process. And finally, from the point of view of background, and to link more closely to what John was saying, I want to go back to, again, 4 decades. Forgive my recounting history here, Chair, but to what was probably the first MSE process, which was involved in the South African anchovy. And allied to that, quite independently, a statistician had gone around the stakeholders and done a survey of what aspects were important from the management point of view. And he ranked them, and right at the top were things like lots of catch, safety for the resource, etc. And one that also is very important, but at that stage perhaps was not realized to be so, catch variability from year to year. That was ranked number 7. And the first time we came to employ the rules that had come out of this process, we had a bad survey result. The net result was applying the rules we'd agreed and the stakeholders had agreed. When we applied them, we said, right, in terms of what you agreed, we have to decrease the TAC by 50%. And mayhem erupted. And as scientists, we said to the stakeholders, but you agreed variability wasn't important. And the response was, but we had no idea when we answered that question, the extent of variability you might be talking about. Now, this, I think, is what links up with John's comment. One's got to be very careful at what level, at what stage of the process you ask stakeholders for various responses. And it was implicit, if not explicit, in some of the points John listed. By all means, at the start, get some feedback at a very broad level. But where you are really going to get the meaningful feedback is when you have quantitative results and you can actually show how much catch you lose if you are going to insist on a low level of variability and so forth. And that was my first and most important lesson in this exercise of stakeholder engagement. Make sure you have real results before you ask stakeholders for their feedback on what's preferable, because they will only give you something meaningful when you're talking in practical terms, not abstract terms, practical terms that they understand, which are things like what's the size of the TAC likely to be and how much are we going to vary it from time to time. So I hope, Chair, you find that a useful amplification to some of John's very useful pieces of advice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. All excellent and useful points to sort of advance the discussion here. Thank you, Doug. And I don't know, I don't see any other hands, nor do I have anything in the chat. But again, I invite all of the participants to ask a question. And if nobody has one, I actually have a question that I could fire out there. So I'll do that while you guys are all thinking about what you'd like to ask and whom you'd like to ask. I would ask a question here to Dr. Nan. Dr. Nan, what would you say are some of the unique challenges that you faced when engaging the really diverse set of stakeholders that you have across the region? And how did you guys approach that?
Thank you, Joe. And I think that's actually one of the key, issues that we have facing during our years of doing the capacity building process. As I mentioned in the presentation, the stakeholder groups in the WCPFC is incredible, diverse, and a lot of them have their own objective, and sometimes those objectives agree with each other, sometimes they are not, and leading to a lot of leading to a lot of different, very different, it leading to a lot of complexity, and make a one-size-fits-all workshop format just simply doesn't work. So to address issues, one of the implementation we start doing is I actually will have all these pre-meetings with the groups, with maybe just one or two of the team leader to really gauging what they really want to learn from these workshops. Either is they want to focus on a specific fishery, for example, some of them are really focused on the long line, some of them focus on the percent fishery and what is the expected outcome. Like you want to know how you're going to respond to this issue that's going to come out in the WCPF's meeting in a couple months. Okay, we can sit down and talk about this. And it seems we have been doing this. I think our efficiency definitely really improved, and people people feels like, okay, well, they are understanding more. And also just take I mean, very good advice from John and Doug is we always show real results in our workshops as well, so people have a real understanding of what they are facing, like very they are going to face in the commission decision when the commission come to decision. So I think that really helped them. We also follow up some of our sections with just very short online catch-ups. Sometimes, and we're always open to any questions anytime. If they have a question or if I'm concerns, they can reach out to us. So I think ever since we try to be more accessible and try to be more prepared to provide more tailored materials, I think that really helped us to become more efficient at communication. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. No, that's great. And I think that's a good example of what really all of our presenters highlighted, which was that communication is key, and in this case, letting stakeholders sort of lead by informing you what it was or what it is, what they were interested in, so that you could be responsive to those needs. I think that's an excellent point. Now, again, I open the floor. It's open for questions. I'm going to throw a couple more out there, and as well to the panelists, if you'd like to ask a question of one of your fellow panelists, or if there's an additional point that you'd like to make here in sort of the closing minutes of our webinar here today. So this next question is for Dr. Walter. Dr. Walter, you were a leader in the development of the Atlantic bluefin MP, which you mentioned, which has been described as one of the most transparent and inclusive MSE processes conducted, at least in an international context and tuna RFMO context to date. This was highlighted in the presentation by Ashley with the study that they had done as well. Could you talk about where you found stakeholder engagement to be helpful in that process, and maybe also a little bit about where you thought that the stakeholder engagement was efficient and well applied, and perhaps some lessons learned about times where it may not have been necessary, even if it was something that was involved in the process.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for that question. One of the time, I think that when you're getting something out of effective stakeholder feedback is when your stakeholders are asking you for more meetings. Then you've actually resonated. But up until the time when you're trying to talk to them and get them to engage and they're not engaging, then something you're doing is not effective. And this, with the bluefin process, before we had real results, engagement was not particularly useful because decision makers in particular operate on very short time scales of what is the decision I have to make and when do I have to make it. So we found that when we engaged too early, we usually didn't get a lot of attention and were talking to ourselves. And so that was one of the times when we found it was not effective. Once we had real results, then we were highly effective and actually requested for more time. Now, I differentiate in the presentation, talk about different stakeholder groups. I think one of the elements that was or I don't have a good handle on how well in the bluefin process we reached the true stakeholders in each contracting party and country, particularly because the true stakeholders are distilled through their countries and through their managers. And so we rely on the managers or scientists from each country to reach their stakeholders. I know that in certain countries, there is an internal domestic process for stakeholder engagement. I'm not as familiar with how that works in many other countries, but I think that's where there's a missing gap between the RFMO process and how it is reaching the true stakeholders, the fishermen in each one of their countries. Partly that's how the RFMO process just works, but it's one of the things that I'd be very curious to see how we can better reach those true stakeholders in each of the countries. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. No, that's an interesting point, and you sort of bring up, I think it was Shana in her presentation who mentioned the idea that there are often national advice giving committees that feed into then the international RFMO processes, and certainly in some jurisdictions those processes are more robust than in others. And so a good gap to point out there, and potentially an area for further work as these MSEs continue to be developed. Doug, Dr. Butterworth, I see your hand, but we also have another. Pardon me. We have another hand from somebody who we haven't heard from, so I'll call on David Slate first. Please, sir, go ahead and propose your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'd actually rather that Doug went first. Is that okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, Chair, just quickly to amplify on your question, I think the example of bluefin was a good one. I think the other particularly good example is NAFO and Greenland halibut. But there's an important difference between the two cases, which I think needs to be borne in mind. And that is, in ICCAT, you are dealing with a group of the order of 50 affected nations. In Greenland halibut, the number arose barely to double figures, and that makes the dynamics of how you interact different. I just mentioned that because that is important. Also, perhaps Shana can show, I hope she's got it immediately on hand, put in the chat a reference to a paper on which she's senior author, which arose out of a meeting in 2017, I think it was, where we tried to put together experience from all the RFMOs on what was the optimal process, including for stakeholder engagement. And what came out of that meeting was guided particularly by the NAFO experience, because at that stage, the bluefin case was not that well developed. But I think there already is quite a bit written that will assist in this regard. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and Shana, if you've got it on hand, please go ahead and share that study. Otherwise, I believe there will be a sort of follow-up message sent to all of the registered participants in the webinar, and so we can share that study at that time. And yeah, I mean, you make an absolutely valid point. The number of stakeholders involved, and also the state of the stock, and the amount of pain that may or may not need to be swallowed by the stakeholders in advancing one of these processes, and sort of the baseline that we're starting from, I think, are critical elements that will influence how these processes sort of go. David, please go ahead and pose your question.
This is not more in the form of a comment.
Okay.
I'm a stakeholder, and I represent approximately 3,000 commercial fishing permits in the U.S. And I've been involved in 3 MSEs thus far. One was Atlantic herring, which was conducted by the National Marine Fisheries Service. The second one was bluefin tuna, and the third was North Atlantic swordfish. At the last 2 at ICCAT. My brief comment here is that if you have stakeholder engagement, but the stakeholders don't understand the information needed to interact meaningfully in the stakeholder engagement process, you haven't achieved stakeholder engagement. Now, I maintain that the objective should be to achieve a modicum of fluency by stakeholders, specifically enabling them to interact effectively in the trade-off space. As John Walter pointed out in his excellent presentation, by the way, don't waste people's time on that which they don't need to know. We've been through this drill in the US. And I just wanted to mention something regarding what Shana's first slide, which is entitled, "What are stakeholders?" And the one element seemed to be missing there was she did not include managers. Managers need to be present during the stakeholder engagement process for the simple reason that they need to understand the stakeholders' considerations. If there are no managers in the room, it's a waste of time, because ultimately it's the managers that are going to be making the decisions, not the stakeholders. Now, all of these presentations actually touched on the issue of communications. And this is something extremely important to me. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact we need to understand who we're speaking to. Who are these people? What do they understand? Most of our fishermen, I would say maybe 40% of them have high school diplomas. They maybe studied basic math, but nothing more. They don't understand statistics well at all. Okay. However, there is a big problem here. If you show them something or you explain something to them, they're not going to raise their hand and say, "Excuse me, but can you explain to me what you just said in plain language?" Because they don't want to look stupid. So what I'm saying here is that we have to get around this idea, get away from this idea that spider plots, violin plots, chicken feet plots, and other sophisticated plots are going to fly with stakeholders. They're not. Okay, so in summary here, I'm saying that scientists at the outset of this project, okay, must be brutally honest with themselves regarding their communication skills. I mean, I don't know personally if communication skills is part of the curricula for a PhD in marine science, but if scientists identify the fact that they just don't have the skills that are needed to communicate with non-scientists, then maybe they need to hire a consultant to help them with that. You know, it's so critically important. And I mean, I will go even further and say that you're not allowed to use words like Bayesian and asymptotic, depensation, or fecundity. You can't use those words with stakeholders. They won't understand them. In fact, the word model, okay, which we use all the time, model is something that a lot of people believe to be a box full of plastic parts which you have to glue together, which result in a plane or a boat, right? They don't understand what model means. And if you're going to use that word, you have to explain it to them. Thanks.
David, thanks. No, all salient points, and apologies for the use of the 10-penny word, or maybe that's a 5-penny word. But no, absolutely. And again, I think you're just, coming from a slightly different perspective, but reiterating many of the points that our panelists have made. And that is that communication is key, and that these processes need to be distilled into terminology and into a way that everybody who's participating can do so in an informed and an effective way. Before I wrap it up, I'd like to just open the floor one last time to our panelists. Anybody who may wish to provide final comments or thoughts on some of the different discussions that we've just had. So the floor is open. And I don't see any takers. And so please feel free to interrupt me if you so desire. But with that, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today and for the excellent presentations. I'd also like to thank the Harvest Strategies Project Advisory Committee, who helped set the agenda for this webinar, and who also provide guidance to all of the different activities being carried out under the project. Big thank you to our interpreters. And last but not least, a huge thank you to the participants. Thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. A date has not been set, but it will take place in late April of 2025. So please look out for that. There will be communications going out through the various networks. I'll do one final plug for the e-learning, which is being developed by the Ocean Foundation in collaboration with the FAO e-learning Academy and with input from a number of experts from around the world, many of whom are on the call today. So thank you to all of those folks that are contributing to that product. It will be coming out very soon. Look for it summer of this year. And again, that will be communicated through the various channels. The recording for this meeting will be available soon on the Harvest Strategies YouTube channel. And so you can access that through the harveststrategies.org website. And with that, I give you all one last big thank you, and I wish you an excellent rest of your day, afternoon, evening, or late night as it may be. And we hope to see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
everyone.